This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State Extension Beef Specialist Dale Blasi as he covers how the K-State Beef Stocker Unit began and what work they do to support cattle producers. Kansas Farm Management Association's podcast with KFMA economist Chelsea Plummer and KFMA Executive Director Mark Dikeman continue the show as they review tax planning strategies and tools. K-State Horticulture Extension Specialist Cynthia Domenghini in today's show discussing how to use cold frames, hot caps, and low tunnels to extend the growing season. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show taking the time to recognize 20 years of the K-State Beef Stocker Unit with K-State Extension Beef Specialist Dale Blasi. Dale, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Shelby.
Dale, can you first explain to us how the K-State Beef Stocker Unit came to be the unit?
Well, about 20 years ago, there was a shuffling of properties. And originally, the unit that we call the Stocker Unit was at one time the Range Unit, as many alumni may remember through their years here as students. It was repurposed, and it was devoted to examine specifically the issues surrounding backgrounding cattle, stocker cattle, calves on grass. So that's been our focus for the last 20 years, is looking at that very important segment of the beef industry.
And there's a lot of work that takes place out there besides just cattle-related things.
Absolutely. It's 5 miles from campus. It's a multi-use facility for the College of Ag. We've worked with folks from wildlife. It just lends itself for people that want to conduct research, and being so close to campus, it helps with agronomy, soils classes that come out and look at the different soil profiles. We really bend over backwards to accommodate the needs of our College of Ag folks.
Wanting to talk about some of that work that has been done to improve the industry over the years, and first wanting to mention a feeding approach.
Right. We refer to it as program feeding or limit feeding, but in essence, it's a practice that we have known in the ruminant nutrition world since the middle 1980s. We have jumped on that approach since 2016 and have really refined its use in this era of sustainability, where we try to do everything we can to improve efficiency of our animals, improve efficiency of the inputs required to produce beef. And given the variation in precipitation in Kansas, I mean, we're essentially a prairie state, and we're always, it seems like, 2 weeks out from a drought. And just recently we were so darn dry, but it has implications on forage supply and ultimately cost. And at its best, in a growing diet, roughage is a diluent. I mean, we typically put a third roughage with a third co-product with a third of grain, be it corn or even sorghum, and we achieve gains around 2.25 pounds per head per day. The limit feeding approach, going from 45% roughage down to 13% roughage, and leaning more heavily on co-products such as wet corn gluten feed, such as sweet bran, or even wet distillers grains, works equally well. We're able to dramatically improve the performance of animals while at the same time reducing the amount of manure output from these same calves. And so, manure management is a millstone around any operation's throat, trying to find a safe haven for it, and working in with compaction, concerns from our farmers with compaction, or maybe introduction of weed seed from the forage being fed. Those are all valid concerns, and by reducing our manure output, it becomes a lesser problem, lesser number of times to refinish the pen space for other cattle. You might be able to stretch it out. Instead of having to clean after every 2 turns on calves, you might be able to stretch it to 3 or 4, simply because you're not accumulating manure. The ease of feeding with this approach is we feed once a day. And for those producers out there that are also farming or maybe having part-time jobs, our observations over the years is that it typically takes about 5 or 6 hours for the calves to completely consume their allotted amount. And the sweet spot we have found is about 2.2% of their body weight on a dry matter basis. We target that. And over time, we have determined that it takes about 10 days for calves to get fully on feed. And we're talking about stressed calves, long-haul type Tennessee origin calves, that getting them on feed. And the big plus about this is by feeding once daily with a limited amount, we're able to do a much better job with health detection. Those calves that are not at the bunk at feeding time, that really helps the cattle observer to do a much better job of observing the pen and catching these calves sooner, quicker, and responding what their needs may be for health.
When it does come to feeding, have you guys also looked at maybe the time of day you're feeding more?
Yeah, we have done that. We did one project we initiated about 4 years ago looking at, during the wintertime, feeding at night. And the rationale behind that is during wintertime, when it gets really cold during the night hours, and if you time the feeding with the animals, the heat of fermentation, the digestion, actually helps to warm the animal. And the way we looked at it was it reduces the maintenance needs to maintain the animal. Therefore, there's more available energy for body growth. And it worked very well. Our interim weights showed it. But then as the project moved into the spring months of March and ultimately into April, temperatures went away and we lost that effect. I told you earlier that we are actually contemplating to do a study during the summer by feeding at night, and the same effect when it's cooler at night, that those animals are able to dump that heat. And again, we want to take a look at that. That's something that our producers can think about when we're dealing with heat stress during our hot summer months.
What other work has been done out at the beef stocker unit to really hopefully drive and improve the industry?
Well, just recently, within the last year or so, a colleague of mine, Dr. Casey Olson, approached me about 6 or 7 years ago and wanted to pursue his observations that maybe instead of just burning our native grass during the spring months, if we could look at alternative months as a means to control Sericea lespedeza, a very noxious, a very aggressive plant that is not productive for almost anything for that matter. And so we jumped into that project, and the work has been published. It's bona fide work. It basically, what we did was to quantify the impact of cattle performance when altering season of burn. And Dr. Olson has a great story in terms of the savings from herbicide and alternative means by which to try to get on top of that really vigorous seed-producing plant. We told a good story there. We were able to stay with it consistently, and it took 6 years of seasonality and everything to get into the model, but we looked at its impacts on plant populations and everything to go along with that. So that's something we really can hang our hat on in terms of what this one animal unit has done for our education mission.
As we talk about these different research projects, is it really to help create and maintain the healthiest animal?
That's correct. I mean, health is a focus of every project that we have done out there. I mean, it's certainly something that we need to pay very close attention to. Case in point, we did shade work a couple years ago. We obtained a NCBA sustainability grant, and the student that did the work actually recorded panting score in terms of heat stress on the animals, for those animals that were under shades versus those animals that were not. And shade, believe it or not, it just like people like to get underneath shades, animals are no different. And we saw a response in terms of improved efficiency as well as a reduction in water consumption. Guess what? When you're not as hot, you're probably not going to drink as much water. And we have water meters on every one of our tanks, so we were able to quantify the pen level consumption of water on a day-to-day basis. So, issues out in western Kansas, I mean, we're looking at it, even though we're in eastern Kansas, we're showing a response, and it's things that our producers, it gives them an opportunity to evaluate and make decisions for their own individual operations.
Who do you see this benefiting and why?
Oh, I think it benefits our producers through the Flint Hills, even as far south as the Osage Hills. This work benefits, talking about the feeding work, it benefits the nation when you look at it, because if you look at the weather maps anytime, there's always someplace in the U.S. that is experiencing drought conditions. And it costs money to move roughage from point A to point B, and then you have to grind it to make it fit. And then because it's only partially digested, you got to haul it off. And so our entire beef industry benefits from this work that we're doing.
Where do you see maybe the beef stocker unit going in the future, Dale?
We're internally in our department, we are in the process of rebuilding our feedlot, and we're consolidating that entire beef complex, if you will, underneath one umbrella so that we can do systems type work in terms of implications of cattle management during the stocker phase and what are the implications as those cattle move into the finish phase. And then hopefully our renovated meat lab will be able to work with our colleagues, our meat scientists, to try to put the full bow around the entire beef complex as relevant for our Kansas producers.
Dale, if people want to learn more information about the K-State Beef Stocker Unit, how can they do that?
Well, we have a really great website, ksubeef.org. There's actually a lot of material and information at our Department of Animal Sciences website, where if you would go to the facilities, there's a good description of the history of the unit. Actually, Shelby, that unit is actually the place where the initial research on spring burning occurred. So there's a lot of legacy, a lot of pride in that property. It's one of our crown jewels for the university, and it's something that we want to make sure that we fully exploit for the benefit of our producers across the state.
Dale, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension Beef Specialist Dale Blasi. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of the Kansas Farm Management Association's podcast with KFMA's Chelsea Plummer and KFMA Executive Director Mark Dikeman as they discuss tax planning.
What are maybe a couple different strategies that producers can take when they are tax planning?
I'd say there's kind of two broad strategies when it comes to income tax planning, and kind of opposite extremes in the thought process with those. The first would be to minimize income tax. There are plenty of tools that farmers have at their disposal to try to minimize that income tax liability. And, in certain circumstances that may work right, in certain years that may work well. But in the longer run, I think a better strategy is really to focus on after-tax dollars, to maximize the after-tax dollars rather than minimize income tax. I do tell people that just because we can do something from a tax standpoint doesn't mean we should. Doesn't mean it's the best long-term strategy. I really encourage people to, like I said, to think long-term. In the long run, we need after-tax dollars to cover family living expenses. And when I say that, I mean family living expenses that aren't covered by off-farm sources of income. So a job or investment earnings or things like that. If those off-farm revenues are not there, then family living needs to be covered by the farm, and that's going to take after-tax dollars. The other big thing to consider in the long run for ag producers is that land has to be covered, has to be purchased or paid for if it's financed with after-tax dollars. And there's not much way around that. So in the long run, to build wealth, there really needs to be some tax paid. I often also encourage people to look at, within KFMA, we work really hard to look at accrual income as well as cash income when we're thinking about tax planning at the end of the year. Looking at inventories of grain and livestock and see where those values are trending. If tax liability is staying steady, but inventory is dramatically increasing year over year, or the value of inventory is dramatically increasing, then there's probably some impending tax liability, some deferred tax liability that we really need to think about and really need to plan for. The final thing I think I'd say in tax planning strategies is don't make capital purchases just for tax purposes. Those purchases need to be made based on need, how well that purchase or how well that equipment fits into your operation, not just for tax savings.
Specifically for farmers and ranchers, why is tax planning so important?
I think one of the big things to keep in mind is the dollars that the average farm deals with in a year. Well, just the volume of revenue, the cost of expenses, small mistakes in planning can have a significant cost, especially if, there's been several low years and then suddenly there without adequate planning, there's a large spike in farm income. From an income tax standpoint, there are several tools we have to kind of mitigate the impact of that. So income averaging can really help in smoothing out the taxable income portion of that. What it doesn't cover is if there is a big spike from one year to the next, the impact of self-employment tax. And if we manage things over time, manage over several years, we can kind of manage the impact of that. But if there's a big spike and other years are negatives, we've kind of lost out. We've left things on the table. We don't want to, as much as we can, we want to avoid an NOL. We want to avoid leaving things on the table that otherwise we could maybe maximize or optimize. Again, looking at brackets, filling brackets, avoiding NOLs, making sure there's not a large spike, and managing self-employment tax over time is really important because those can be costly. Again, really cost dollars. I mean, it's going to impact the pocketbook in the long term if it's not managed correctly.
So, Mark, what are some tools we can use to maybe decrease our expenses if we get towards the end of the year and realize our income is a little lower than we would like?
Yeah, there's a couple of tools, Chelsea, that we have at our disposal for as far as decreasing expense. And I think what we're going to discuss here as far as decreasing expenses or increasing income is going to come into play in 2024 with dry conditions in a lot of the state and commodity prices where they're at. It sure looks like 24 is going to turn out to be a rough year from an income standpoint. Two bigger tools that we have. One of them is pretty flexible and allows us to plan after the fact, which is pretty important. And that's decreasing or slowing down depreciation. So the default depreciation method that we deal with in the farm area is 200% declining balance. We have an option or can elect to depreciate using 150% declining balance, which is quite a bit of a drop from that 200% declining balance. We can also elect to utilize straight line, which again is even lower depreciation in the first year than either the other two methods. There is also an election to spread out that depreciation over a longer life in most cases. That's called ADS or alternative depreciation system. We can elect to depreciate over, say, 10 years instead of 7. Again, all of these elections are available to be made after the fact. We don't have to do anything before the end of the year to plan for these. I'll point out, though, that none of these elections change the total depreciation that is taken over the life of that capital asset. It just changes the timing. With 200% declining balance, that depreciation is very much front-loaded in the life of the asset. And as we make those elections, it spreads the depreciation out more evenly over the life. The other option is to potentially capitalize long life repairs. So a larger repair on a combine, those get just getting into the shop and having someone go through the combine can get very, very expensive. So we potentially could capitalize that repair, spread that expense out over time rather than treating it as a deductible expense all up front. We can also do some some fertilizer expenses, longer life fertilizer. So typically nitrogen is going to be used up very quickly. But P and K may have longer life. Lime is going to have a longer life, and we can make an election to, or we can treat those fertilizer expenses as capital, kind of amortize those, spread those out over a number of years over the life of that fertilizer rather than deducting those all up front.
When it comes to maybe the idea of trying to boost up the income side, gross receipts, what maybe options do we have from that avenue?
So the options we have here are, we do have several, but unlike the depreciation items that I mentioned earlier, these do require a little bit of advanced planning. We need to make decisions about these options prior to the end of the year. Opportunity or the option is to sell inventory. If we know we need some income, we can sell some more inventory. The problem there, twofold. Maybe I don't want to take advantage of the current price. Maybe I think the price is going to increase in the future, so I don't want to sell now. The other difficulty or potential difficulty is just getting that grain or getting the product to the elevator in time before the end of the year. If I'm doing tax planning on December 23rd and I've got to get $500,000 worth of grain to the elevator, that may be difficult in a short period of time. Those require a little bit of advanced planning, making sure that I can get to that target. One option to maybe help with low commodity prices, if I don't want to take advantage of that, one option might be to utilize a commodity credit corporation or CCC loan. And I receive loan proceeds based on the bushels of grain that I have. I have the option then to treat those loan proceeds as income rather than loan proceeds. So I may be able to boost up income a little bit without actually selling the grain before the end of the year. Then there's some pros and cons to those CCC loans. They take some advanced work. You do need to work with your local FSA office to utilize those. But in the right situation, they can work very, very well to bump up income a little bit without hauling grain to town. Another option I'd throw out to people to consider is selling some underutilized capital assets. If you've got equipment that sits most of the year or hasn't been used for a couple of years, maybe it's a good time to go ahead and sell that, generate some income from that. Maybe it's also a timing of a sale and purchase. If I'm considering a trade, maybe I sell the asset outright in 24 and wait till 25 to purchase the replacement. So there's some flexibility in the timing of things that we could benefit there.
Once again, that was Kansas Farm Management Association's Mark Dikeman and Chelsea Plummer. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net where you can listen to the full podcast episode, or you can find it for yourself by going to AgManager.info/KFMA. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. If you're looking to extend the growing season a bit longer this fall, there are some options for keeping the soil and air warmer around plants to promote growth and protect from freezing. K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini says that gardeners can use cold frames, low tunnels, and even plastic milk jugs to help protect cold season crops. Cynthia, there is still some gardening going on actively right now, but we also reached that point where we would like to maybe extend the gardening season as long as we can, and there are a couple of options that you'd like to talk about.
Sure. Plenty of gardeners are ready to be done and clean out those beds and put some organic matter down and just let it rest. But for those of us who would like to continue gardening, there are some cool season crops like some spinach and other leafy greens that can be continued into the winter months by using some season extenders like hot caps and cold frames or even low tunnels.
Now, I've heard of the low tunnels, but I've not really heard about hot caps. What are those?
So hot caps are actually pretty simplistic. One of the examples that I've used is taking an old empty milk jug the plastic kind, maybe a gallon size, and cut the bottom off of it, leaving most of the milk jug intact, and then placing that over the top of the plant. 1 milk jug per plant, for example. So that will create a miniature greenhouse effect and warm the area right around each plant. And on those sunny days, you actually need to be kind of monitoring. So if you're going to use season extension, you still have to do some work in the garden to make sure you're not making it too warm in the garden. So when you've got your crops covered by these plastic season extenders, if it's a sunny day, even if it's cold outside, those little greenhouses you've created are going to heat up real fast. So it's going to require you to kind of monitor it and vent them as needed so that you're not cooking your plants. In the case of the hot caps, you could simply take them off the plant. We'll talk about low tunnels and cold frames. They have options for you to be able to open up the plastic covering and allow the cool air in and the warm air out.
And the low tunnel really just kind of what it sounds like. It's a low plastic tunnel.
Exactly, yes. It's a covering over, usually it's raised beds, but it could be in-ground beds as well. And there are hoops made with plastic material or galvanized pipes that are bent. And those hoops are spaced about 3 feet apart and secured to the ground or the raised bed. And then a plastic covering is put over the top. It's basically the short version of a high tunnel. So it's low enough that you can't walk under it, but it does create a nice covering for your winter crops.
And that would be most appropriate for maybe a small garden then?
Sure, either one of those. The hot cap would be a pretty small garden because that would be a lot of milk jugs to manage, and a low tunnel as well. We're talking smaller scale usually. There are some larger operations that will use a type of low tunnel to protect their crops, but typically we're talking backyard gardens usually.
And then the cold frames, how would we use those?
One example of a cold frame is, think of a box made out of wood, maybe about 4 foot by 2 foot, with an old window hinged to the top side of it. So that can be lifted and placed over a sensitive crop. And then the window, because it's hinged, can be propped open or closed depending on the weather. So on those warm days, you can open up that window and allow the air to filter in and out. And on the cold nights, you can close it down and protect your crops from the cold weather. And again, this is small scale. We're talking about backyard garden protection. It's a great way to continue your gardening, which is great for healthy nutrition, but it's also great for mental health. You know, being able to get out and garden for as much of the year as possible is really beneficial. Being out exposed to nature and sunlight is something that I'm always going to encourage.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist with information on how to extend the growing season and protect cold season crops. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.